was said to reside both on the inside and outside. Friends and family say that they never even heard Mary use one word of profanity in the time that they knew her. And if Southern Belle had a definition, they say that Mary's image would be used under the definition of Southern Belle. Mary was born in the 50s and she grew up in South Carolina with her 3 sisters, and she was really close with her sister. Mary was valedictorian of her high school and was sure to be a catch based off of her beauty and brains. She was very smart, she was very driven, she was very beautiful, and she just had so much going for her. Mary eventually married and became a teacher. She excelled in this job, and it was almost as if the job was made for her. So Mary and her husband conceived a baby and named her Jane. Eventually, Jane was born, but the marriage was not doing so well at that point. While they adored their daughter, the couple decided that a split was going to be the best outcome for them. So they agreed to get a divorce, and they have their divorce, and Jane stays with Mary. I really am not sure if Jane ever went to see her dad very often, but she was with Mary for the most part. So Mary was in her 30s at this point in life, and a lot of people married young in this kind of era, so it wasn't like super abnormal that she was married young, went through a divorce, and was still only in her 30s, but she had so much time left to further her career and have more kids if she wanted to, or meet another romantic interest if she wanted to. She had so much time to do whatever pleased her. So in 1981, when Mary was 31 years old, she met and started seeing a man by the name of Edmonds. And Edmonds, like Mary, had already had children from a recent or from a past marriage. So Edmonds had a young son named Tennant, who was 10 years old, and a daughter that was 2 years old named Molly. Friends and family say how supportive Edmonds was of Mary, and that he basically gave her the world and then some. He helped her raise Jane, and Mary practically did the same with his 2 children. Edmonds was head over heels for Mary, and he proposed marriage with Mary, and Mary said no. So it would actually be 8 years of Edmonds just proposing marriage, saying, let's get married, just proposing this idea of marriage, and Mary continually brushed him off and said no. She was happy with where their relationship was. She didn't feel the need to get married, and they could just continue as they were. Another issue was Edmund's children and the impact that this second marriage would have on them. One of the major issues was Molly, who is now 10 years old, did not get along with Mary, and this is a little bit odd because everybody got along with Mary. She was a teacher and everybody loved her. So it was kind of a jealousy, like attention thing that Molly's father was giving Mary instead of Molly, and she was just very young. So I think Mary just had a hard time agreeing to marriage, knowing the strain that it would put on this father-daughter relationship, and it almost seemed like it was kind of a selfless act by not getting married to Edmonds rather than a selfish act. So Edmund's son Tennant was now in their teens at this point and really excelled in school and sports. They were pretty antisocial and considered kind of a misfit amongst peers. Tennant did not take after their younger sister in their feelings towards Mary. Tennant loved Mary from a very young age, again the age of 10, and wanted to befriend her, have her as a mother figure, whatever. So Mary was good to and good with Tennant, and I'm sure that she wished she could be the same for Molly. It just wasn't working out that way. So friends and family recall Mary thinking that there was something strange with Tennant, but they really didn't know what. No one could put their finger on it. I'm not sure Mary could put her finger on it. It just remained that Tennant was a very sweet, but just very odd child. In 1988, for whatever reason, Mary decided to stop seeing Edmonds. Whether that was because of this uncomfortable strain that her relationship was putting between Molly and Edmonds, or something with Tennant, or just something else entirely, the two stopped seeing each other. And this was Mary was in her 40s at the point of this breakup, and she had been with Edmonds for about 7 years. So Molly was probably happy to see Mary go, but Tennant and Edmonds, they were not happy to see Mary go. So Edmonds really did try to stay pretty aloof and stay out of Mary's life, but young Tennant really had issues coping with the loss of this mother figure, and Tennant was around 18 years at this point in time. So after the breakup, Tennant wanted to still see Mary and continue to know and grow a relationship with her. They would ride past her house to say hello and just show up and chat with her at basically every opportunity that they had to do so. Mary was a very, very sweet woman. Again, Southern Belle, very polite. She didn't see any harm in her ex-boyfriend's son chatting her up from time to time. Mary's daughter, Jane, who was probably the closest to Mary at this point in her life, recalls a couple things about this whole scenario. She says she does remember thinking that it was odd that Tennant could not move on from Mary. She felt it wasn't a mother-son relationship that Tennant sought for, but it just seemed like Tennant wanted to be her friend and wasn't really, again, seeking this mother-son relationship. So Jane goes on to say that Mary had admirers of all ages, and basically from the kids that she taught in school who would tell her that she was beautiful, up to married men that were 10 years older than her. Everyone admired Mary for her personality and beauty. About a year after Mary and Edmonds had broken things off, Mary and Jane came home to their house seemingly having been broke into, and they checked everything, all the valuables and anything that a robber would take if they were breaking in. None of that was gone. Nothing was taken. And so at first they thought this was just really odd, like somebody broke in and took nothing, until they came across some clothing and makeup that was stolen, and it was of Mary's. So Mary had some clothing and makeup stolen, and that was the only thing taken. So at this point, Mary is kind of freaking out. They didn't come for money. They didn't come for anything valuable. They came for personal items of Mary and who would do this. So Mary was so shaken that she called her own mother to tell her how afraid she was by this theft, how personal this theft felt to her. And Mary's mother, being the slightly confrontational woman that she was, felt she knew exactly who was behind the theft, and she thought it was Tennant, the once son to Mary, who dropped by the Witherspoon household just a little too often. So Mary's mother was tired of hearing about all of these kind of somewhat creepy, off-putting stories that Mary had about her ex-boyfriend's son. So she took things into her own hand and confronted Tennant. So Tennant didn't come out right and say that they stole these items, but when Mary's mother pushed them to return them, the items showed back up. They were returned to Mary's home. So without, proving or speaking words, it was assumed that it was Tennant who broke in and took Mary's items. So when Mary's daughter Jane learned that it was Tennant who took her mother's items, she said that she felt absolutely disgusted. She's obviously between anybody. She wanted to be polite. She wanted to believe the best in people. Plus, this was a kid that she has known since they were a toddler. So it's just kind of an odd situation. You can't say how she should have reacted. You can't say how you would have reacted in her shoes. It's such a particular situation, and Mary was doing her best. Mary's problems seemed to kind of just vanish in regards to Tennant for 8 years. So 8 years Mary got to live her life and travel and love her daughter and volunteer and do all of these things that she loved doing, until a day in 2001 when Mary, now in her 50s, looked out her window and saw a 30-year-old Tennant walking around her backyard. So I'm going to actually put up a picture of Tennant about the same age range that they would have been in the yard. And I don't know if you've picked up on the fact that I am using they, them pronouns. Tennant, at this point in their life, their pronouns were he, him. Now, at this point, today as we're talking, their pronouns are not he, him. So, and just to be respectful to anyone else that has changed their pronouns, that's why I will not be using the he, him pronouns for Tennant. I'm sure you picked up on it at this point, but I have a picture of Tennant up on the screen, and Tennant was not secretive, was not sneaky about just being in Mary's yard. They did not come at odd hours. They did not try to hide. They literally were just there and wandered around, maybe tried to chat with Mary. It's just very odd. It's a very odd situation. And it was almost as if they wanted Mary to know that they were there in her yard. I feel like that'd be really uncomfortable and awkward, but it's just hard to wrap your head around what exactly went on when Tennant was just standing in Mary's backyard. So Mary confided in lots of friends and family about these new incidents that started occurring after 8 years of peace. And they were all so worried for her. Some of her friends actually went and reached out to Edmonds saying, your son is out of control. But he wanted to stay disconnected, and he wasn't even really, he didn't have a good or any relationship with his son at that point. So Edmonds did nothing, and friends told Mary that she should contact police about Tennant, but Mary just could not get herself to. This was a toddler, or Tennant was a toddler, a small child that was basically a son to her at one point. And what crime would she tell the police that he was committing? And I know now that a lot of people would call this in as stalking. It is stalking, but you just have to think about the time period and just how much more clarity there is about stalking and stalking statistics now. So in April of 2003, Mary was getting some freshly cleaned laundry from her dryer when she noticed something was off. She had washed her underwear, and there were multiple in this load of laundry, but now, as she's taking them out of the dryer, there were none. Horrified, Tennant's face crept into Mary's mind. They had done this once, nearly a decade ago. Keep that in mind, nearly a decade ago was when Tennant first broke into her home, and now they've done it again with her underwear from her dryer. So again, instead of involving police, Mary just installed a security system, and she also chatted up some local police and just asked if they would keep an eye on her home. 3 months later, in July of 2003, Mary was on her way home from work, and she just had to swing by the house to change, but she had PTA meetings, so she would not be there very long. Tennant was in her yard when Mary arrived, and she actually engaged in conversation with them at this point. And she was polite. No surprise there. She said, "I'm sorry, I can't visit. I'm running to PTA." She then went inside, changed her clothes, and left her home. The very next day, Tennant was in her yard again, this time escaping her home with a pillowcase stuffed full of Mary's clothing. So she happened to come at just the right time that they were leaving with clothing that belonged to Mary, and they were kind of in this stalemate. They were looking at each other, and Mary was stuck and stunned and did not move. It was clear what Tennant was doing, and I really just want you to imagine how Mary felt and the terror that you would feel, and just how unsettling and horrifying this situation is. And again, Tennant looked at Mary, Mary looked at Tennant, and Tennant simply walked out of the yard with her items right in front of her. So Mary knew at this point that they were trying to scare her, or they simply did not care that Mary knew that they were taking her items. Mary was terrified. She was scared before this, but she was even more scared now. She called her sister right after this incident, and Mary's sister recalls this conversation, saying she could hear the fear in her sister's voice. She says that Mary still did not know what to do, and she was stuck between being polite and actually turning them in, which I think she was also worried would upset Tennant further if she did that. Even though she feared Tennant's retaliation, friends urged Mary to come forward to police. Eventually, Mary did decide to come forward, and Tennant was arrested. Tennant already had a criminal record and would likely receive a harsher sentencing on these new crimes because of his past. So Mary felt a little bit better. She said that she knew that they would be out again one day, but that she could have some peace of mind, at least for now. So because of this impending doom of Tennant's eventual release, which was, again, still undetermined at this point, Mary signed up for something that's called Vine, and this is a victim notification system that would notify Mary when Tennant was being transferred or released from jail, so she could do whatever necessary preparations that she needed to do. So with this system in place, Mary felt like she could finally relax. She spent a lot of her time with friends, with suitors, with family, and Jane. She was still teaching. She was essentially worry-free and knew that she could be until the day that notification showed up. So this perfect summer she had that was free of worry was kind of like Mary's calm before the storm. On November 14th, Jane Witherspoon got a call from one of her mother's close friends that Mary did not show up for work that day. Jane was concerned immediately, even though they had this piece from the Vine system. Anything could be wrong. It could be entirely unrelated to Tennant. So Jane lived 3 hours away, had her own life, had a husband at this point, but her and her husband jumped in the car and drove to Mary's house. So on the way, Jane called police and gave them permission to enter Mary's home. Police recall the house being messy. There was food out. There were personal items on the ground, such as Mary's watch on the floor. As they slowly worked their way up through the home, kind of all in all, it was pretty messy, which I think they knew was out of the ordinary for Mary. Once police made it to the second floor bathroom, they discovered Mary's body. She was found without clothes, submerged in water. Her feet and hands were bound with tape, and it seemed as if her cause of death was strangulation. There was a knife on the floor nearby. She had no signs of life, and once confirmed, she was pronounced deceased. It was also confirmed that Mary had been raped. So once family was contacted, everyone's minds went to Tennant, but Tennant was in jail. Mary had not received a notification about Tennant getting out of jail or anything, so it had to be somebody else. Like, this is obviously a murder, but who else could possibly have done this to Mary? Police found a pocketbook that was actually property of another individual that lived in the same neighborhood. So police had to follow this lead and check it out because, one, they were concerned this person was a victim of whoever did this to Mary as well, or two, this person could have been involved in the murder. When police found this individual safe and sound, they learned they did have an alibi and that it was likely that this pocketbook was stolen from her home prior to them going over to Mary's house. So Mary's daughter spoke with police as soon as she got there, and she said, "Can you please confirm with me that Tennant is still in jail?" And her heart sunk when they told her that they were not in jail. But it made no sense. Why was her mother not notified? Did she miss this notification? Did they escape somehow and there wasn't a notification? I don't know. So they obviously looked into this, and after checking Mary's messages, there was a couple of major mistakes. The first one, there was a message from Vine, but the message was that Tennant was being transferred. But Tennant was not being transferred. Tennant was being released. Not only this, the notification got to Mary the day after she was murdered. Two major, humongous flaws in this Vine system that Mary was using to have peace of mind could have been fatal. These mistakes could have been fatal. They could be the reason that Mary was not prepared. She had no way of knowing because she wasn't notified in time, and the notification that did come through wasn't even correct. So when police were shown a picture of Tennant, their jaws dropped. They've seen this person. In fact, they've seen them stalking the streets of nearby this crime scene all day long. And a lot of the times they have, the people that just have to come and look and check things out, but this is now a suspect and not considered somebody that's just a little nosy. So police set up an operation to try to talk with Tennant, and Tennant was back within 20 minutes of this kind of operation starting. So they noticed that Tennant was holding a set of keys, and they were a little afraid to spook Tennant, but they started questioning them, and Tennant did kind of get spooked and asked for an attorney. And I don't know how the officer managed to get the keys that Tennant was holding away from Tennant, but the officer got them and walked up to Mary's house, stuck the key in the door, turned, and click. Tennant had Mary's keys. So Tennant was arrested literally on the spot right then and there. And another little odd tidbit of information that I want to include is Tennant's driver's license had Mary's address as the location he resided. Even creepier, the license was made that day. So if it was Tennant that killed Mary, they killed Mary, went and got a new license, and then returned to the crime scene a bunch of times throughout the day. It was later determined that at the time of Tennant's arrest, they were wearing Mary's undergarments. Tennant, who was nearly Mary's son, if she would have said yes to one of many proposals from Edmonds, murdered her. A woman Tennant looked up to for years, a woman Tennant eventually stalked and became obsessed with. Some more creepy details of this case come out. Bits of paper that were in Tennant's possession were found with Mary's signature on them. So Tennant was practicing Mary's signature, and these bits of paper were actually found inside of Mary's car, which was stolen and parked elsewhere by Tennant. They also found a blueprint of Tennant's plan, starting with killing Mary and kind of going through what the steps were that they were going to take after. They were going to take a mortgage out on Mary's home. They also learned that Tennant had some items shipped to Mary's house, which included a wig in the same length and color of Mary's, breast forms, and makeup. Experts say that Mary was killed so that Tennant could become Mary and just kind of like step into this role as Mary, and no one really understands or like really knows why Tennant thought that that would work, that her family would just not notice her missing. So experts also think that it was very anger motivated because of Mary turning them in, and also possibly from Mary's just kind of like disregarding them for many years. So after going through a pile of personal items, police learned that Tennant had a strong desire to have his sex change, and again, Tennant eventually makes this change and no longer go by the pronouns he, him. DNA proved that Tennant was in fact the rapist and murderer of Mary. So police say evidence support that they forced their way into Mary's home when she opened the door to maybe a knock, maybe the doorbell. Tennant overpowered Mary and brought her upstairs to rape her and strangle her and leave her in the bathtub. They then walked downstairs, cooked themselves breakfast, ate a portion of that breakfast, left, and went to go make themselves a new license with Mary's address on it. After Mary's murder, many practices were taken up to improve victim notification. Something called Mary's Law also offered more strict penalties for stalkers. Tennant ultimately pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. They're actually Catherine now, so it's hard because at the time that these crimes were committed, their name was Tennant, yet that technically is a dead name to them now. At some point after their incarceration, they started going by the name Catherine, so they actually are hoping that the state will pay for their official sex change, in which the state will not comment on this request. Justice was brought to Mary, but it feels a little off considering the issue with the Vine system, and it really also does not erase the years and years of torment that she was put through by this relentless stalking. So if you feel like you or a loved one have a stalker, please don't take it lightly. It really can transform overnight, over an instant, and please seek assistance or just tell somebody. Please don't keep that stuff a secret if you can help it. And with that, I have nothing else for this week, so I will see you guys next week. Please stay safe. Goodbye.